The largest organ associated with the nervous system is obviously the brain. Most of your neurons are found in the brain, and this is what controls the nervous system and, in fact, a lot of the body. The brain is housed safely inside the skull. That's why we have the skull, is to help protect the brain, as well as to hold some of the important special structures needed for sensory information, such as vision, hearing, taste, and smell. In addition to being protected by the skull, the brain is protected by the meninges. These are 3 layers of membrane that help to protect the brain and the spinal cord. There are 3 layers to the meninges. The dura mater is the outermost layer. This is a very tough connective tissue membrane. Deep to the dura mater, we have the second layer of the meninges, the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is a little bit more delicate layer. It's a layer of simple squamous epithelium, and it's connected to the dura mater by a layer of connective tissue. The arachnoid mater is important because this layer is what holds the blood vessels that are on the surface of the brain. We don't have a lot of blood in the brain, but we do have vessels along the surface of the brain that are important for supplying the structures that will make the cerebral spinal fluid that we'll talk about shortly. The innermost layer of the meninges is the pia mater, and the pia mater is a layer of simple squamous epithelium that's right on the actual surface of the brain itself. This follows all the ups and downs and the ridges and valleys of the brain. In between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is a small space called the subarachnoid space, and the subarachnoid space holds cerebral spinal fluid. This creates a layer of liquid cushion between the brain itself and the skull, and the brain sort of floats in the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is important for a few functions. First, it does help to support the brain and protect it with this layer of liquid cushion. Your brain actually floats in the cerebral spinal fluid within your skull, which is important because this helps prevent damage to the delicate lower part of the brain. If we didn't have the cerebral spinal fluid, the brain would sit on the floor of the cranial cavity and would actually crush some of those cells at the bottom with the weight of the brain. With it being surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid, it can float within the cranial cavity and prevent putting weight on the brain cells themselves. The cerebral spinal fluid is also important for providing nutrients to the cells of the brain and for removing waste. Since we don't have a lot of blood vessels in the brain itself, the cerebral spinal fluid helps to exchange those materials and supply some of the support that we usually find from the blood. The third thing the cerebral spinal fluid is important for is maintaining the right balance of ions for the cells of the brain. This is a little bit different than the concentrations of ions we see in the blood, and so it's important that we can maintain that ion balance for proper functioning of the neurons. That means we need to have the right amounts of things like potassium, sodium, chloride, and calcium. The cerebral spinal fluid circulates through openings in the brain and through the subarachnoid space I mentioned earlier. The openings in the brain are called ventricles, and the largest of these openings are called the lateral ventricles. They're found deep in the middle part of the brain, and within those lateral ventricles we have what's called a choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is the structure that has access to the blood supply, and it filters the blood in order to create the cerebral spinal fluid. The choroid plexus is all lined with the ependymal cells. Remember those support cells that are important for lining the openings of the brain and producing the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid circulates from the lateral ventricles, the largest ventricles within the brain, down into the third ventricle. The third ventricle is found in the middle of the thalamus, and we'll see more about that a little bit later. It's a narrow ventricle right in the very middle of the brain. From there, the cerebral spinal fluid goes down through a tunnel called the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is down by the cerebellum of the brain. And from the fourth ventricle, some of the cerebral spinal fluid goes down around the spinal cord, and some of it goes up into the subarachnoid space of the brain. And in that subarachnoid space It's reabsorbed by special structures called the arachnoid villi and gets returned back into the bloodstream again. A typical brain produces and reabsorbs about 500 milliliters, or half a liter, of cerebral spinal fluid each day. And its creation and then reabsorption is what gives us a nice continuous flow of those fresh nutrients and the removal of waste that's necessary for the health of the neurons in the brain. The blood-brain barrier is what's responsible for limiting what can pass between the blood and the cerebral spinal fluid. This is important so that we can provide what the brain needs, but keep out things that could potentially be damaging to the brain. The blood-brain barrier is formed by three components. First, we have the tight junctions between the ependymal cells. So ependymal cells are held together by tight junctions so nothing leaks between them. The only things that are going to get past the ependymal cells are things that go through the ependymal cells, not just leaking between them. The second component of the blood-brain barrier are tight junctions between the capillary cells. In most areas of your body, some small molecules can leak out between the capillary cells instead of having to go through them. In the brain, those capillaries are stimulated to form a lot of tight junctions, so the capillaries essentially waterproof, and only things that can go through the capillary cell are going to be able to get in and out. The third component of the blood-brain barrier is the astrocytes. The astrocytes are glia that are associated with the capillaries of the brain, and these astrocytes sort of wrap around the capillaries and supply another component of the blood-brain barrier. So in order for a molecule to be able to get from the blood into the cerebral spinal fluid where it can access the brain, it has to go through the capillary cell, past the astrocytes, into the ependymal cell, and out of the ependymal cell on the other side to get into the cerebral spinal fluid. The sorts of things that are able to get through the blood-brain barrier are the types of molecules that can cross the membranes of cells. So that's going to include molecules that are small and nonpolar, or molecules that have transporters. The sorts of things that can get into the cerebral spinal fluid include important things we need, like water, glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, amino acids, and fatty acids, as well as some things that we don't necessarily wish could get into the brain, but are small and nonpolar enough to make it through membranes. That would include things like caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, and a number of drugs. The sorts of things that can't cross the blood-brain barrier are large things, or things that are polar and don't have transport molecules. This includes most bacteria and viruses. It's relatively difficult for bacteria or viruses to get into the brain, although it can happen. Proteins also usually can't cross the blood-brain barrier because they're too big. And a lot of medications and antibiotics can't cross the blood-brain barrier. That can prove to be a problem if there is an infection in the brain, because we have very few drugs that have the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier so that they could be able to fight that infection.